Hello everyone, it's Diane. My room is a great big mess, but I've got these 3 domestic arts journals finished and ready to go into my shop, and I want to show them to you before I take time to clean up my room so I can get them listed. So let's just get started. I did show this one on a live stream video, but you know, I'm just learning to do the live stream, and I have a lot to learn, obviously. The picture was narrow because I had to do it on my phone, and it was in mirror image. So it was hard to see. So I'm going to flip through this without going into all the detail I went into on the other video. I tied it with a coffee-dyed muslin strip. It's got this really neat vintage braid. I love this. And the vintage pom-poms on the front. This is Better Homes and Gardens, Treasury of Country Crafts and Foods, and it measures 8, I did this yesterday and then I forgot, 8 by 11.5, so it's a large book. It has a 3-inch spine. I threaded some buttons through the threads. I made it so that the threads were on the outside of the book this time, and then I threaded some buttons through. And the back is just plain with a little bit of vintage trim there. And there is a lot of different things in here. This is wallpaper on the front and back inside covers. There are pages from craft books. There are vintage pieces. This is a vintage playing card and vintage railroad agent stub. And what was I saying? Well, you'll see what kind of pages are in here. So this is vintage wallpaper, and I put vintage trim on it, and this little tag this book belongs to is tucked in there. I didn't want to cover up that wallpaper. I do have images from 2 large vintage pattern books, the pattern catalogs that you see at the fabric stores. I have a 1980s one, I forgot what year exactly, and I have a I think it's 68 one. So you'll see images from both of those books in here. There are a lot of fabric tabs. This is from a large appointment book. There's fabric pages. These are from a sample book because it has all the info, the name of it and the stock number and all of that, all the information you would need for buying that fabric, a decorator fabric. There's a paper clip up here, one of the ones that Paula Furter made on her tutorial with tickets. And this is a piece of a vintage sheet and a little vintage children's playing card. I have to clip it on because I will forget where to put it. And then there's a lot of vintage things in here, so I'm just going to flip through and you'll be able to see. There's lots of pockets, lots of hidden tuck spots. There's one over here with a page from a craft magazine in there. This is from the 1968 book, pattern book. This is a book jacket, dust jacket, and I covered it with craft book pages. There's some writing pages here. This is influenced and inspired by Gina at TheReBookery. She has a Etsy shop called TheReBookery, and her YouTube channel is TheReBookery. So she made these kind of journals, and I loved them, so I decided to try my hand at it. This is also from the pattern book, and it's a slipcover pattern. There are pieces of vintage feed sack throughout these journals, and this is an embroidery transfer. It's not vintage, but I mentioned in the live video that Jennifer from Fabric Thread Needle, which is where I get the vintage feed sack fabrics, she has some vintage transfers, and I was just talking with her today, and she wants to put together some journaling kits that would include the fabrics, some of the vintage transfers, some paper ephemera, and something else. I forgot. But she wants to put these kits together, and then she'll let me know when they're done, and I can let you know to go on over there and check them out. So it'll probably be a week or more before they're ready, but I will let you know. There's a vintage tabbed index card in here, the blue one, and then vintage rickrack trim, and a vintage flash card and feed sack fabric. A vellum stamp collector's envelope with just some little pieces of paper for writing on, tucked inside. And I glued it on as a little tuck spot, so there's a folded guest check tucked in there. One of my pink guest checks that are available in my shop. And this is an envelope. There's a little tab or card that I made with feed sack fabric and one of the pages from the craft books. This is obviously from a craft book, and there's a recipe card tucked behind it. Paint chip. This is from a vintage children's book. There's some scrapbook paper. This is a vintage packaging for shoulder straps for making lingerie. Window envelope here. You can see the vintage lady through there. A tally card is sewn on here. This is from the printed doll fabric, or doll clothes fabric. This is just an image to show you what the completed doll clothes are supposed to look like. A wide lace pocket here, and I stitched these pages together. These are vintage, probably from the 70s. Current note papers from the current catalog. This is not a vintage calendar. It's from this year, actually, and it's just the pages. They were just stapled to a cardstock board. So I sewed two together, formed this pocket, and then made a little booklet with some notebook paper and a page from the craft book and feed sack fabric. An applique and play money. This is a fabric pocket with a little fabric piece there. A vintage playing card. This is from the slipcover pattern, and there's an inventory tag tucked inside that. This is also from the current book. It's vintage. I think that's probably from 70s or 80s, and there's a vintage needle book inside. This is curtain fabric sample book that I had, and I love that it's sheer and it has the cardstock around it to make it sturdy. And then I used one of my giant tags. These are in my shop. I had a couple tags I wanted to show you. Oh, here they are. This is just the size it comes, which is 4 by 8. So it's a nice large tag if you're making large books like the 3-ring or 5-ring binder books or books like this. And I just stamped on it and used distress ink around the edges. And there's lots of journaling room on that. But I also folded it up and stamped. So I folded it up big enough for this stamp and then this stamp and tried it out. So it's a nice little pocket. You can put a little tag in there or a journaling card or something. Even tuck a photo in there. So that then you can use them in smaller books too, but I just think they're really fun. And I'm going to do all kinds of things with those giant tags. The signature starts with a fabric pocket, and there's a little booklet inside. There's a little tuck spot here. Vintage wrapping paper. Little card here. An envelope with vintage braid glued on, and there's a couple of cards inside the envelope. A vintage envelope here with an image from the craft books and some feed sack fabric. There's a pocket here with a page from a recipe book. vintage, obviously. And there's a little tuck spot here. This is crewel embroidery thread from a half-finished kit that I found at a flea market. And there's a clear plastic pocket here. This is vintage gift wrap with a pattern tissue stitched to it, and it's coffee dyed paper on the back. A vintage rickrack packaging from Ward's. A couple of cards tucked in there. When you have to build your pages so that they're big enough for these big books, it gives you lots of opportunities for pockets and tuck spots, as I mentioned in the live video. There's a pocket here with nothing in it. I just love that girl's attitude. There's some vintage pom-pom trim on this. This is a Currier and Ives calendar. It's 1984. This is a little booklet made with the pattern book. This is another paper clip, and it's got a vintage little raccoon sticker on it. Pockets here. A vintage zipper. This is quilted fabric from that fabric sample book. There's vintage upholstery trim and some feedsack fabric for the pocket, and some more up here. This is from the pattern or fabric sample book. I just cut the ends off and stitched it to the back side of the quilted fabric. A vintage card and an envelope made out of a recipe book. Play Money. This is a current postcard. These cards are perfect for the domestic books because the ladies pictured are all doing domestic duties. She's hanging up clothing, laundry, a little snap card. And I tried out stitches on my new machine, so you'll see different kinds of stitches. Vintage library pocket with some wrapping paper and a vocabulary card and a paint chip. Here is a yarn sample card that I found at a flea market just for fun. You could journal on the back. And here's the packaging from that vintage zipper. There's another lady from my pattern book, and it has my signature here. This is more wallpaper. So this is the first large book. The second one is a little bit smaller. They all have 3-inch spines. This one measures 7 by 10 1/4. Good Housekeeping New Complete Book of Needlecraft. There's fabric on the spine. I added more buttons to this one. I liked the buttons on the first one, so I decided to add even more, and then I left the strings long. So I like the way that looks. There's some trim on the front and the back, and then some vintage braid there. And then I had to decoupage the dust jacket onto the front and back because it was just a plain book with a dust jacket, and the dust jacket was a little bit tattered, but I like that look. So I just Mod Podged it on. And there's some vintage rickrack sewn on, or glued on. There is a pocket on the inside of this one with a vintage children's illustration of the children washing dishes. Here's that Currier and Ives calendar. All the pages are laid out the same, except in a little different order, and different pictures and different, images and things. So I'll just kind of flip through a little quicker now. This is a crocheted piece up there. This is the bottom half of a really long metal zipper. The third book has the top half of this zipper. And I love this vintage trim here. It looks like carpeting. This one has 3 spots for tags. Little vintage card. Another yarn sample. Little vintage girl there. Fabric pocket with this little booklet inside. Vintage braid up here. Vintage seam binding packaging. Some beadsack fabric. Some pom-pom at the bottom of this. I put them in facing that way so that you can see the ladies through the mesh on the burlap. Oh, I wanted to point out that this piece of fabric was actually a little bit too long for this book. It kind of stuck out farther than I wanted it to, the burlap part did. But when I stitched it in, it folded itself down in there and made a little pleat, and it's perfectly even. I did not do that on purpose, but I liked it because it made the page the right size. So that worked out great. So there's just a little bit of a pleat there. There's some cards in that envelope. Vintage postcard. Here's the clear pocket. Wrapping paper. This is the printed doll clothes you were to cut out and sew. I stitched a little blue vintage rickrack along the side there. There's a nice pocket in here. And there's a pocket here with a little booklet with notebook paper. This is vintage lace. Paper's inside that envelope. There's a recipe back there. Another image from that children's book where the children are doing housework. A music flashcard. Someone sent that to me and I love it. Finally using it. I was hoarding them. Here's an old Stokely's tomato juice label someone sent me. So I glued it to cardstock, printed cardstock, because it was a bit fragile. You can see the lady through the window there. And it's a pocket. Bridge tally. Here's another lady from the doll clothes fabric. Little booklet there. This is a vintage applique and some Monopoly money. A pocket made from the fabric sample scrap. Curtain pattern. Here's a vintage greeting card. I put it on as a tuck spot, and this is where that flower applique came from, and I just glued a message paper on it for journaling, but left the back as it is. Another one of those large tags. Vintage tickets and a little tiny playing card. Vintage wallpaper and another of the current cards. This lady is shopping, always in the market for news. Another piece of embroidery transfer. Paper clip with a vintage child's card. Vintage postcard, and this is a game card or something. It was a pack of cards I got at the Salvation Army, and it's all places. I don't know if they're supposed to be flashcards or education cards or what. Vintage vocabulary card here. This is from one of the craft books, the book about Afghans. There's some vintage pom-pom trim and a round playing card and a little scrap of fabric. This is a bridge tally sheet tucked in here. A little piece of vintage wallpaper. And a book jacket, Island of the Blue Dolphins, and a vintage recipe card and another vintage recipe card tucked in. I turned this flap of the book jacket into a pocket. This is a little pocket made from a vintage pattern instruction, and there's a little piece of vintage handkerchief stitched on it. Vintage wallpaper, another envelope. This came out of the vintage pattern book, and this is the vintage crewel embroidery yarn. I just tied it into a bow and glued it on her dress. It doesn't go in that way, it won't fit. This is a vintage pattern card that would be in the file cabinet for the patterns. Somebody sent that to me. So that one is Complete Book of Needlecraft. And I think I'll do, well, I might as well. This will be a long video. This is All Time Great Afghans. I'll try to go more quickly through this because it has pretty much the same elements. Again, the same fabric and lots of buttons on the side. This one I had to wrap some fabric around this edge because I Mod Podged this piece on upside down, so the finished edge ended up over here in order to have the picture right side up. There's some vintage pom-pom up here. A part of an envelope here. This one has the vintage ribbon spool part on there. I thought that was cute. And this lady is ironing. Vintage card. Envelope in here. I like the little Peanuts cards. Library pocket with vintage wrapping paper, yarn sample. These books will be great for collaging in, gluing down your photos and memorabilia, journaling in. There's all kinds of things you could use these books for, and I think they'll be really fun to use. I hope you agree, because I have a lot more of these covers that I want to use. So I want to see how well these three do in my shop to see if I want to make more. This is a little folder made with pattern tissue, and so each one has a little pocket. And I just stitched this corner of a vintage handkerchief to the front. There's several pages of this here for writing. This is a layaway card that I just got from the Brown Pear on Etsy. I'll try to remember to link her shop. The Argyle pattern for those socks. Little plant card from Kristen. Thank you, Kristen. This, I don't know what this is. It was in a bag of stuff that I got at the flea market. It had a bunch of sewing things in it. So I just stitched it on here as part of this little collage tuck spot. I have the guest checks in my shop and these little tags in my shop too. And there's Monopoly money. Little fabric pocket there. Another needle card tucked behind a vintage card, greeting card, and another sheer pocket. A little booklet here. Vintage wrapping paper. There's another lady in this card, or in this pocket. There's a pocket here, vintage wrapping paper and sewing pattern. And another little booklet. Look at that needlepoint pattern. It was supposed to be for a nativity, a needlepoint nativity. And this is a little dress made out of a round tablecloth. It has instructions here if you want to make one. Alright, so we have the Afghans, the Book of Needlecraft, and Country Crafts and Food. Those are the 3 books that I'm going to have in my shop. By the time this video is up, these will be listed in my shop, and I will link the shop below. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this long video, and come on over to my shop and check it out. Thank you. Bye-bye.